Hello and welcome to the Mystery Guy YouTube channel. I hope you're all doing well and staying healthy. So then let's begin our video of the day. High in the remote stretches of the Indian Himalayas, where jagged peaks cut the sky and mists coil, like smoke lies a frozen enigma, Rupkund Lake. At first glance, it's just a small, icy pond tucked among the rocks. But take a few steps closer. Imagine you're on a pre-dawn trek through this cold, desolate landscape, and you'll spot something beneath the glassy surface. Bones, skulls, human skeletons, perfectly preserved by the ice, scattered across the lakebed like a forgotten battlefield. These aren't the remains of a single tragic event. The bones belong to people who died centuries apart, some separated by hundreds, even thousands of years. It's as though this lake has quietly claimed lives across time, drawing them in one by one, only to reveal them in chilling silence. The world first learned of this strange place in 1942, when a British forest ranger stumbled upon the lake. Since then, Rupkund, now often dubbed Skeleton Lake, has captivated scientists, historians, and explorers alike. And the more they've uncovered, the more bizarre the mystery becomes. Genetic testing revealed something unexpected. The people who died here weren't from one tribe or region. Some were local to South Asia, others came from as far away as the Mediterranean. They shouldn't have even crossed paths. And yet, here they lie, together, beneath the ice. Decades of research have failed to answer the most haunting question. What brought these people to such a remote, unforgiving place? And why did none of them return? Tonight, we explore the enduring mystery of Rupkund Lake. We'll delve into what science has uncovered, the theories that seek to explain the lake's gruesome collection, and the eerie pattern that still defies logic, a frozen graveyard that seems to call people across time, only to trap them forever. So settle in. Maybe dim the lights, because this is the story of a silent lake where the past still whispers. The discovery of skeleton. Lake Rupkund Lake rests more than 16,000 feet above sea level in the rugged Indian state of Uttarakhand. Cradled by snow-draped peaks and cut off by treacherous trails, it's barely more than a puddle by size, only 40 meters wide and less than 10 feet deep. But getting there is no small feat. Reaching Rupkund takes a grueling 5-day trek through dense forest, wind-swept, alpine meadows and narrow rocky paths. The lake remains frozen for most of the year, thawing only briefly in summer to unveil its grim secret. The environment around the lake is brutally inhospitable. Survival here is a challenge even for the experienced. Bitter cold, sudden storms, razor winds, and ever-shifting weather make the journey perilous. Oxygen is scarce, the vegetation sparse, mostly tough grasses, hardy shrubs, and wildflowers that cling to life in the thin air. The wildlife, too, is sparse. Only a few specialized. Species call this place home: snow leopards, Himalayan tahr, musk deer, and a handful of other resilient creatures. It's a landscape that barely tolerates life. And yet, strangely, it has drawn people here again and again throughout history. A deadly altitude, and a hidden warning even. The birds grow scarce at this elevation. The air is thin, the winds punishing, and the terrain utterly unforgiving. These extreme conditions explain why Rupkund has long been whispered about as deadly and best avoided. For generations, local shepherds knew of the lake, but they didn't speak of it lightly. They passed quiet warnings through the hills, advising one another to steer clear of the place. Sacred, yes, but unsettling. A place to be respected and left alone. Beyond the shepherds and the occasional wandering ascetic, the world knew nothing of this frozen graveyard. That is, until 1942. It was during that year that Hari Kishan Madhwal, a British forest ranger stationed in the Himalayas, found himself traversing this remote region. Tasked with mapping the wild terrain, he made his way through the snow-laced slopes when he stumbled upon something unexpected. Rupkund Lake. As he approached its still shoreline, something caught his eye. pale shapes scattered along the edge, glinting unnaturally in the morning light. Curious, he stepped closer. Then he froze. Bones. Human bones. Skulls grinned silently from the icy shallows. Rib cages, leg bones, jaw bones, scattered among the stones and partially submerged in the lake's cold water. It was as if the mountain itself had coughed up a long-buried secret. Madwal's first assumption was tragic but simple. Perhaps a group of pilgrims had been caught in a sudden storm. It wasn't uncommon for religious travelers to make dangerous mountain crossings. But as he examined the bones more closely, the truth became harder to explain away. These skeletons weren't fresh. They were weathered and bleached, their surfaces worn down by time and the brutal Himalayan elements. These people had been here for much longer than a season. They had been here for years, maybe centuries. Word of Madwal's discovery spread quickly, and soon researchers, historians, and scientists began making the arduous journey to this secluded lake to learn more. But what they found was even more disturbing. It wasn't just a few skeletons, it was hundreds. Men, women, even children. Their bones lay scattered around the lake's perimeter and submerged beneath the crystal-clear surface. And none showed signs of obvious injury. There were no weapons, no belongings, no clothing, tools, or clues. Just bones, left behind in eerie silence. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling it became. Skeleton Lake and the stories. It keeps as word spread. Rupkund Lake quickly became known by a more chilling name, Skeleton Lake. The discovery captivated the world, igniting fascination and fear in equal measure. At first, some speculated that the bones belonged to lost Japanese soldiers from World War II, but by the 1950s, that theory collapsed under closer scrutiny. The remains were far too old, and none bore the marks of modern warfare. Instead of providing answers, science only deepened the mystery. Despite decades of investigation, from genetic testing to carbon dating, no single explanation could account for the sheer number and variety of the dead. Who were these people? Why had so many gathered at such a remote, unforgiving place? And most unsettling of all, what caused their sudden collective death? To begin answering these questions, it helps to look beyond the microscope, into the stories whispered by those who've lived in the shadow of the lake for generations, haunting legends of the lost travelers. Long before scientists began their studies, the people of the region had their own explanation for the skeletal remains. Passed down through oral tradition, these stories are deeply embedded in the local culture, tales not just of warning, but of reverence and belief. One of the most enduring legends tells of an ancient king named Jasdawal. According to the story, King Jasdawal was traveling through the Himalayas with a massive entourage, his pregnant queen, soldiers, servants, dancers, and musicians. Their destination? The sacred shrine of the goddess Nanda Devi, a revered and powerful deity said to dwell high in the mountains. The king's journey was meant as a pilgrimage, a spiritual plea for the goddess's blessing on his unborn child. But something went wrong. Some versions of the tale say the king's lavish procession offended the goddess's sense of humility. Others say the queen, being pregnant, violated an old taboo forbidding expectant mothers from entering the goddess's sacred domain. Whatever the transgression, the outcome was the same. The goddess, enraged, summoned a terrible storm. Massive hailstones, some said to be the size of cricket balls, rained down from the sky. With no trees for cover, no caves for shelter, the entire royal party was caught in the open. The king, his queen, and everyone with them were struck down by the sudden, violent storm, their bodies left behind, scattered along the lake's edge. But this legend is not the only one. For centuries, the path near Rupkund has been part of a sacred pilgrimage route to the Nanda Devi shrine. Each year, villagers and faithful pilgrims brave the treacherous trek through high mountain passes and unpredictable weather, believing that completing the journey earns the goddess's favor and spiritual protection. Yet not all pilgrims returned over time. Stories grew. of travelers who vanished into the mist, of those who may have strayed from the path, broken taboos, or failed to show the proper respect. Locals began to believe the bones around Rupkund belonged to these lost pilgrims, victims not just of nature, but of divine judgment. To this day, the lake is seen not only as a place of death, but one of power, a sacred site that demands humility and punishes pride. The wrath of the divine and the reach of science. For generations, the bones at Rupkund Lake were seen as a warning, a punishment delivered by divine anger. The lake became a place of reverence and dread, where the careless or prideful were claimed by the mountains themselves. To many, the legends explained everything, and for decades those stories were the only explanations anyone had. But when science finally turned its eye toward Rupkund, the narrative began to shift radically. Chapter 6. When science uncovers a deeper mystery, at first, researchers thought the answer was simple. Perhaps a single group of pilgrims had met their end in a sudden, violent storm. A tragedy, yes, but an isolated one. For years that theory held, but it was wrong. According to National Geographic, as many as 500 to 800 individual skeletons have been observed in and around the lake. The true number may be even higher. Some remains have likely been buried beneath rocks, lost in shifting sediments, or eroded by time and human contact. This wasn't the result of a single disaster. This was something else entirely. Multiple groups of people, possibly over centuries, had perished in the same isolated place. Different times, different backgrounds, same fate. The mystery deepened. Serious. Scientific investigation began in the early 2000s, when DNA analysis and radiocarbon dating were still in their infancy. The first tests seemed to confirm the old assumptions. The remains belonged to South Asians who died around 800 AD. Researchers theorized that a group had possibly fallen through ice during an ill-fated journey. Many of the bones belonged to young adults, men and women between 18 and 35, along with some children. A tragic accident. Mournful, but explainable. But the truth was still waiting beneath the ice. Then came a turning point. In 2019, a team of scientists from institutions including Harvard University, India's Birbal Sahni Institute, and genetic labs in Hyderabad returned to Rupkund Lake. Armed with cutting-edge DNA sequencing and more precise radiocarbon dating, their goal was simple: to finally get definitive answers. What they uncovered shattered every previous theory. The bones speak, but not clearly with high hopes of finally solving the mystery. The 2019 team of scientists descended upon Rupkund Lake. They believed the bones would offer a straightforward story, something clean and final. They were wrong. What they uncovered instead was a sprawling, tangled web of timelines and origins, a mystery far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The data revealed that Rupkund Lake wasn't the site of a single disaster. It was a graveyard of multiple tragedies, spanning nearly 1,000 years. Out of the 38 skeletons examined in depth, 23 were of South Asian descent. But even these were not from one group or one time period. Some dated back to the 7th and 8th centuries, while others came from around the 10th century. This shattered the long-standing belief that the remains were from a single pilgrimage gone wrong. Then came the most startling discovery. 14 skeletons, dated to the 17th and 18th centuries, showed genetic links to the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically to the Greek island of Crete. That's right. Cretans, nearly 4,000 miles from home, somehow ended up dead on the frozen shores of a Himalayan lake. No known historical documents mention a journey like this. No trade records, no legends, nothing. To make things even stranger, another individual was found with Southeast Asian ancestry, pushing the range of origins across 3 separate regions of the world. And still, the question hung heavy in the air. Why? Why would people from such vastly different places and eras make the brutal climb to this remote, inhospitable lake, only to die there? Theories in the ice in search of answers. The scientists expanded their scope. Geneticists continued their sequencing work, while archaeologists from the Birbal Sahni Institute dug into the soil and surrounding area, analyzing sediments and organic remains that might offer new insights. Several compelling theories emerged. One of the most popular suggests that Rupkund Lake served as a sacred pilgrimage site, possibly connected to the goddess Nanda Devi, whose shrine still draws devotees today. This could explain the repeated presence of South Asian individuals, spiritual seekers drawn to a holy place, despite the deadly risk. But this doesn't account for the Greeks, or the traveler from Southeast Asia. Another theory points to ancient trade routes. The Himalayas were once crisscrossed with paths linking India to Tibet, China, and Central Asia. Rupkund may have sat along, or near, a lesser-known mountain pass. Perhaps these groups were merchants or nomads, attempting to cross the range, only to fall victim to the merciless weather or to misfortune deep in uncharted terrain. Some may have strayed off course. Others might have sought shelter and found only cold silence. One thing is clear. Rupkund is not just a lake. It's a threshold, a place where time and geography collapse into a single, eerie tableau. A lake that collects the lost. What the bones won't say, theories in conflict. Scientific teams continued their research at Rupkund. One thing became increasingly clear. There was no single, simple answer. Detailed forensic studies of the skeletons revealed a grim truth. The dead had suffered in different ways. Some bones showed unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma to the skull and shoulders, damage consistent with being struck by something heavy falling from above. This matched the legend of King Jasdawal and the deadly hailstorm. Some hailstones in the Himalayas, according to meteorological records, have grown as large as cricket balls. One such storm, with no shelter in sight, could have easily become a massacre. But that wasn't the only pattern. Other skeletons told different stories. Some showed injuries more typical of falls, perhaps off cliffs or into the rocky shallows. A few bore signs that suggested they might have been crushed under heavy snow or ice, hinting at possible avalanches. And then there were those who seemed to have died not violently, but quietly, curled into themselves, as if they had simply laid down and never stood up again. For them, hypothermia or high-altitude sickness was the likely killer. In thin air, under a cold sky, all it takes is one wrong decision, one missed step, and the mountain takes everything. Researchers also found that many of the victims were unprepared. There were no weapons, no treasure, and no significant cultural artifacts. The few objects recovered were modest: pieces of bamboo parasols, fragments of fabric, wooden walking sticks, a couple of earrings. These weren't warriors or wealthy. Traders. These were travelers, and likely not expecting death. Searching for the reason. They came, even with all the evidence. The biggest question remains: why were they there? Why did so many people, from such wildly different places and times, end up at this one lonely lake, high in the mountains, where nothing grows and nothing survives for long? The hailstorm theory, once the dominant explanation, is now considered incomplete at best. While some remains clearly show hail-related injuries, the sheer span of time and geographic diversity makes it implausible that the same type of storm killed different groups centuries apart. So researchers turned to exposure and hypothermia. At 16,500 feet, even a slight drop in temperature can be deadly. A snowstorm or freezing rain could disorient and overwhelm even a seasoned traveler. But again, this fails to explain why anyone was up there to begin with, much less why so many never returned. Then came a theory that felt almost like something from an adventure novel. Recent genetic tests suggested that some remains might trace back to the Eastern Mediterranean. This led a handful of researchers to speculate: could these have been scouting parties from Alexander the Great's army? In 326 BCE, Alexander the Great reached the borders of India and is known to have sent scouting groups into the foothills of the Himalayas. Some believe that a lost detachment may have wandered too far north, becoming stranded in the mountains. If true, this could explain the Mediterranean DNA and perhaps even some of the older skeletons. But there's no direct evidence. No coins. No weapons, just silence and bones. The lake that keeps its secrets despite decades of study, countless hours of research, and state-of-the-art technology, Rupkund Lake remains one of the most enigmatic places on Earth. Some say it was divine punishment. Others believe it was the work of nature at its most merciless: hail, snow, disease, or deadly missteps in thin air. A few even wonder if it was something else entirely, something we're not meant to understand. Scientists now largely agree on one thing: there was no single cause. The bones at Rupkund do not belong to one tragic event, but many, scattered across centuries and cultures. Pilgrims, traders, wanderers, each drawn to this unforgiving place for reasons we can only guess. Some may have come for faith, some for fortune, and some simply because they got lost. The idea of ritual sacrifice or voluntary death, though hard to confirm, cannot be dismissed outright. There are cultures where death in a sacred place is believed to bring spiritual freedom. If this was the intent, it would explain the lack of personal items. These weren't people fleeing or fighting. They may have been walking into eternity on purpose. Others point to poisoned water or deadly algae blooms. But modern tests show no trace of toxins. Some suggest avalanches swept the bodies in from above, but the skeletons lie too neatly, too whole, too undisturbed for that to be likely. In the end, the truth may be some strange mix of myth and meteorology, legend and logistics. Maybe the goddess Nanda Devi was watching, or maybe it was just wind, cold, and bad luck, repeated across generations. Sleeping with the dead today, Rupkund Lake is a protected site. Trekking routes lead brave visitors up the mountainside. When the snow melts just enough, the bones still appear, sun-bleached, still staring, still resting just beneath the waters. Surface, no tombstones, no names, just 1,000-year-old silence. It's one of those places that humbles you. It makes the sky feel larger, the wind feel colder, and your breath a little more precious. And as you lie back, drifting to sleep, think of them. The dancers, the kings, the wanderers, the pilgrims. They stood where no one should stand, under skies too high, in air too thin, and never left. Maybe they were looking for something. Maybe they found it.